Dr. Martin Marty is the Fairfax M. Cone Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus of the History of Modern Christianity at the University of Chicago. Marty has authored over 40 books, and he edited for some time the Christian Century, a well-known periodical. In the early 1980s, Marty's beloved first wife died, and he wrote a book of reflections called A Cry of Absence, Reflections for the Winter of the Heart. Perhaps some of you have read this book. In it, Marty describes what he calls a wintry spirituality, the times in our lives when our spirituality is marked by questions of suffering and evil, when we're trying to talk to God, but no matter what we do, we can't seem to get a clear connection, no way of knowing at all if God cares one bit for what we're going through, and no way to get any answers to these questions we are shouting at the sky. It takes me aback a little bit to know that this very distinguished, very smart Christian thinker has problems accessing God. If even Martin Marty feels that God is silent and inaccessible sometimes, I guess we shouldn't be surprised if we run into that same problem every once in a while. We can bet that there will be times in our own lives when we cannot seem to hear the voice of God or even see any evidence of God all around us. We can't see God at all. We turn again this morning to our friend Job, who even in the middle of hot and dry Mesopotamia seemed to be living with this wintry spirituality. He was suffering and he just couldn't get a hold of God. God wasn't answering, no matter how hard Job tried to get a response. Remember, last week we talked about the situation of suffering in which Job found himself. Attacked on all sides by every imaginable kind of trouble, Job has now lasted for 23 chapters of painful illness and mind-numbing grief. To add to his distress, he's surrounded by all kinds of not-so-helpful friends who offer their different views on why exactly he's in this situation. We come into the story this morning during a loud lament. Job is sick and tired of listening to his friends, and he feels sure that if only he could express himself to God, God would address his situation. But God is nowhere to be found. Silent as an abandoned house, painfully, retchingly silent. In fact, God won't respond until chapter 37. 37 chapters of pain and angst and searching for God, and God is silent. It's not that Job is confused about what he thinks of his situation. Here in chapter 23, he lays his case out plainly. The problem is he just can't get a hold of God. Can't find God to present his case, can't locate the divine. Riotous pain and horrible loss, and for 37 chapters we have silence. And it's not a warm and comfortable silence either. Job was in pain, he was agitated, and in fact, if you read the chapter, it's not really silence at all that Job is experiencing. It's just that Job is the one doing all of the talking. Over and over, we hear him complaining, not that God isn't listening, but rather that he just can't find God. The silence is broken by Job's complaint over and over again. He keeps crying out, and then nothing. Screaming into the darkness and hearing nothing except the echo of your own voice. Terrifying. And that's where we begin this morning, with the urgency of Job's quest. You can hear it in the text. My complaint is bitter. I am groaning. Oh, that I knew where I could find God. Job was desperately looking, and he was learning what Christians over the centuries have learned, as Thomas Merton puts it. If you find God with ease, perhaps it is not God you have found. Job didn't find God. Job found nothing. Nothing except echoing silence. I got to wondering as I read Job's story, what if God's silence was not absence, but actually a way of communicating presence and power? After all, a God who comes when we call would get really old really fast. If we were able to just snap our fingers and make God materialize like a genie in a bottle, what kind of God would we have? We would have a God who was powerless, subject to our whims, a God with no meaningful ability to change anything. I recall one Christmas when I was about 5 years old, I wished and wished for a special doll that you could actually feed. It came with all the baby utensils and all the little packets of food to feed the baby. I must have had great hopes for that toy since I'm the oldest of 5 and observed my mother actually feeding real babies, my sisters and brothers. I imagine I thought it would finally be so great to have my very own baby to feed. Well, Christmas morning arrived, and sure enough, under the tree was the doll I had wished for, brightly packaged with all the baby food she could possibly need. And I was happy. And I fed that baby. I fed it and fed it and fed it all day long. In fact, I fed that baby so much that I used up the entire supply of food in one day. And do you know that that baby just sat there and ate every bit of food I stuffed in its plastic mouth? Didn't protest at all. Didn't act full, didn't cry or get antsy, just ate and ate and ate. And when all the food was gone, that was pretty much it for me. I really can't remember ever playing with that doll again. She had lost her power to engage me. I think that would be the way we would perceive God if God came to our every beck and call. If we could control God, tell God what to do, snap our fingers and make God appear. That would be no relationship at all. Perhaps the silence of God is not really the absence of God. Perhaps what Job needed and what we need from time to time is an opportunity to express, to voice our sorrow and pain and hopelessness to God. Not so that God will know how we feel, God already knows, but so that we can begin to understand our role in relationship to God, so that we can realize finally that we are not in control and that God is not some divine bellboy who comes every time we ring. God's silence is, in fact, a kind of presence. Silence is a strange way that God communicates with us, allows us to listen to ourselves, to hear our own arguments, to tire of our control, and to ultimately surrender everything we think we need to God. I want clear-cut answers just as much as the next gal, but trying to convince me that God is a drive-through won't help me when I'm in pain and I need to know that God is all-powerful, that God is mysterious, that God has things under control. As Job found out, God is elusive, not always available on our terms, silent sometimes when we feel that just what would heal us would be one word from God. As part of living with the silence of God, we're welcomed this morning not to run screaming in the other direction when our doubts begin to surface. The silence of God, or our inability to get a response from God, whatever you want to call it, brings on doubt. Strong believers we are until we punch in the regular numbers we thought would give us access to God and get nothing. What happens? We begin to wonder, is God really there at all? Does God have any clue what's going on in my life? Does God care? Good. Good. That's so good. Frederick Buechner writes, whether your faith is that there is a God or there is not a God, if you don't have any doubts, you're either kidding yourself or asleep. Knowing, of course, that sermons are prime nap time for some, it's very likely that some of you are indeed asleep right now, but I think Buechner was not talking in such a concrete sense here. We have to face facts. While we are people who live with questions about our human situation, some can be easily answered with reason and intellect. But there are those questions that elude our thinking processes, and no matter what we do, we can't find answers. Let's face it, many questions are just unanswerable. God's silence, what seems like God's absence in times when you're suffering, might cause you to ask some hard questions. In fact, you might begin to doubt your faith. If that happens to you, take heart. You and me, like Job, should be comforted by the fact that asking questions, having doubts, is not for the faint of heart. In fact, our questions are statements of faith. By shouting our questions to the sky like Job did, even when we don't hear a clear answer, what we're doing is a rather powerful interaction with God. When we ask God questions, we're acknowledging that there might indeed be someone out there to hear us. We can't be 100% absolutely, positively sure, but we're willing to take a chance, to bet our very lives. In fact, when we ask, We're saying in effect this: I believe in you, God, enough to trust that you will indulge my questioning. I believe enough to shout at the sky and to know that even if all I hear back is the echo of my own voice, you love me. I believe even when I can't see it, in the power of your goodness. If you often wait to hear from God with no luck, then you have come to the right place. The church represents over 2,000 years of people who, embracing their questions, have offered them back to God over and over again until the cacophony of voices blends together to form a sure and beautiful confession. We believe that God exists even when God is silent. Take heart, friends. Doubting in the face of God's silence, is a sign of faith. So, how do we go about living with God's silence all around us? How do we go about living with hope and expectation of God's answer when we cannot seem to hear anything? Well, that's where you come in. Each and every one of you. Job didn't have a community of people who helped him remember that God was there even when he wasn't receiving answers to his questions. All the people around him helped him doubt. His wife, his family, his friends, none of them believed that God was there at all. None of them held up a banner of hope for Job. In the darkest, most quiet moments of his suffering, Job didn't have any loving voices to surround him and to remind him of God's everlasting love. When God is silent, when my heart is aching because I cannot hear a word of comfort or direction from God, I have to tell you, I need you. I need all of you to remind me that God's silence doesn't mean that God is absent. I need your voices to remind me and to hold me accountable when I begin to buy into that falsehood that God should be available for me whenever I snap my fingers, whenever I feel God should show up and give me an answer. That's why I'm at church every Sunday, and I suspect that's why you're at church too. You need a hopeful group of people around you to buoy you in times of God's silence, to carry you through moments of doubt and pain, to surround you with tangible evidence of God's love, even when you're not getting neat, prepackaged answers to the hardest questions of your life. The community of faith should be a community of hope, a community of people that gather together to call us to remember over and over again that God is here, that God is loving, and there is never a time when God has abandoned us. One of the greatest modern thinkers on the absence of God is Nobel Prize-winning writer Elie Wiesel. His life is a story of listening for God, finding nothing but silence, and slowly making his way back to faith, surrounded by people who, even in the face of horror and suffering, affirmed that God was alive, that God was listening, that God was there. When Elie Wiesel was 14, Nazi soldiers took Elie and his family and crammed them into a railroad car, separated men from women. Boys went with fathers, girls went with mothers. Families were divided, never to see each other again. Freedom disappeared. Night came. Even the days were covered with darkness. God appeared to be absent. Wiesel's family was killed, and slowly, Elie Wiesel's faith died. By age 15, he began to pray Psalm 22, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me?" His book, Night, tells of his journey of faith through the dark night of the soul. In one memory, Wiesel recalls celebrating Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, in Buchenwald. The leader would cry out, "Bless the Eternal, blessed be the name of the Eternal," and Wiesel would think, why? Why should I bless him? Wiesel could only think of all the misery and death and pain that surrounded him and wonder where God was. But still he heard voices rising. All the earth and the universe are God's. All creation bears witness to the greatness of God. And even as his faith was slowly dying, Wiesel heard the voices of those who refused to believe that God was absent. At age 15, he heard these proclamations of faith, and they followed him all the way through utter despair and disbelief and back, finally, to faith. The faith of those around him carried him through. At age 16, Wiesel was liberated from the concentration camp. Eventually, he came to this country to live. In 1986, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and in his speech accepting that honor, he affirmed his faith. Listen to the words of faith coming from the heart of someone who has suffered profoundly, doubted the existence, never mind the goodness of God, and yet emerged with hope. He began his acceptance speech like this. Words of gratitude. First, to our common Creator. This is what the Jewish tradition commands us to do. At special occasions, one is duty-bound to recite the following prayer. Blessed be thou for having sustained us until this day. I remember, it happened yesterday or eternities ago, a young Jewish boy discovered the kingdom of night. I remember his bewilderment. I remember his anguish. It all happened so fast. The ghetto, the deportation, the sealed cattle car, the fiery altar upon which the history of our people and the future of mankind were meant to be sacrificed. It is in his name that I speak to you and that I express to you my deepest gratitude as one who has emerged from the kingdom of night. We know that every moment is a moment of grace, every hour an offering. Not to share them would mean to betray them. For Elie Wiesel, sharing the suffering reminded him that God is never truly absent. God's silence is not God's absence. And when we are duty-bound to look over at each other, to touch a hand, to wipe a tear, to join our voices in song and affirmation, what we're doing is reminding each other that God loves us, that God is here, that we are not alone. God is with us as God was with Job and with Martin Marty and with Elie Wiesel, even when we cannot hear God. All around you are living, breathing ambassadors of God's grace. When God seems absent, you can look to your right or your left, all around you, and see lives of experience and faith, people who will remind us we are not alone. And we can never be abandoned to our suffering. God is here. Amen.